A promise of a new dawn for Libya. Rival factions agree to form a unity government and hold elections in December. But will the warring sides and their foreign backers allow this latest attempt at peace to succeed? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. 10 years of war has left Libya divided, with two rival governments and armed groups battling each other. Now there's a promise of a new beginning. The warring sides have selected an interim prime minister and a presidential council to form a unity government until elections in December. The United Nations, which mediated the process, is calling it a chance at national reconciliation. Libyans are cautiously optimistic, despite the failure of previous attempts at peace. Malik Traina reports from Tripoli.
In what the UN is calling a historical vote, participants of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum voted in a new transitional government. Their objective: lead Libya to parliamentary and presidential elections in December.
This is a moment for historic compromise, for reaching, we've already seen it, people are reaching across the divide. The guarantee is that what you are doing now will serve your people.
Libya has been engulfed in conflict for the last 10 years, since an armed revolution toppled longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. In April 2019, just days before a UN-facilitated national conference, warlord Khalifa Haftar began a military campaign on Tripoli, with support from Egypt, Russia, and the UAE. In June 2020, they were forced to retreat towards eastern Libya after the UN-recognized government, with Turkish support, retook western Libya. Here in Tripoli, most people are hopeful that this transitional government can make some changes.
The government will have a large task at hand. It will not be easy. We hope they will be able to make some changes, but because it's such a short term, I doubt they'll be able to do much.
The only thing we want from this government is for it to bring us elections. We want the decision for who holds power to return to the people.
Although hopeful, some have doubts that the elections can take place so soon.
The last government was supposed to stay in power for 1 year, but they've been in power for over 5 years. We hope they stick to their promise and help the average citizen and provide basic services.
After years of violence and political divisions, most Libyans want something to believe in and to hope for. And for now, many hope that this new transitional government can lead a reconciliation process and bring about elections. Malik Traina, Al Jazeera, Tripoli.
Turkey, Russia, France, and Italy have welcomed the agreement, but those same countries have given military support to rival sides in the conflict. The eastern government in Libya, which is allied with warlord Khalifa Haftar, says it's time for foreign intervention to end.
We shouldn't forget that foreign forces are on Libyan soil, occupiers from all corners of the earth, all the world's intelligence, and the mercenaries who came from all over the world. We have to get rid of them, and this mission, a task of the new interim government's prime minister, will not be easy if nobody stands with him.
All right, let's bring in our guests from London. Jum'a al-Qumati, Special Envoy of the Government of National Accords, Prime Minister Faiz al-Sarraj to the Maghreb countries. In Istanbul, Anas al-Qumati, founder and director of Sadiq Institute, Libya's first independent think tank. And in Vienna, Wolfgang Pusztai, a security and policy analyst and former Austrian defense attaché to Libya. Thank you all for joining us. Jum'a, let me start with you today. What's the reaction been thus far across the political spectrum in Libya? And where does this new interim government leave things for politicians like yourself and other politicians?
Well, I think from what we've heard yesterday and today, the reaction has been somewhat relief, possibly, especially in the west of Libya, especially amongst those who are supportive of the GNA and of what we call aspiring to set up a democratic state in Libya and oppose the military option, which is represented by Haftar on the other side. So those have been relieved. They have been there have been some joy as well. I think simply relieved because there was one certain list that did not win. They were fearful that the list headed by Aguila Saleh might win, as has been predicted by many analysts, and it did not win, because that would have been very controversial, very divisive, and possibly make things worse rather than better. And there were many forces on the ground, especially in the west of Libya, who said they could not entertain seeing somebody like Aguila Saleh, who supported the war on Tripoli, who is officially responsible for the war crimes that have been uncovered and seen, especially in Tarhuna, as he is the chief commander of the forces of Haftar. That to see him being elected as the head of this interim government in the next months would have been too much to swallow. So there is a relief. I think the group that the four that have been elected, they are they are not controversial. They are not seen as divisive. They can deal with all, and they can reach out to all or most of the strands of Libyan political and tribal and regional parts. And in a way, in that sense, maybe their job can be easier. However, I think what happened yesterday is only a small step, possibly and hopefully in the right direction, but it's not the end result. It's not the final solution. And I'll tell you one thing, Mohammed, having been part of the Khairat process in 2015 and the way the GNA was announced then, I think the way this government was reached yesterday was far better. There was a transparent process. At least there were elections. We have seen a ballot box, which is very symbolic for Libyans who have only seen guns and missiles in the last few years. And although the electorate was only a small group of 75, and 2/3 of them were handpicked by the UN, nevertheless, it is an electoral process, and it is transparent, and it is an election, and it is a sign and a symbol of what Libyans want to see in the coming years and decades, inshallah.
Anas, will the rival governments and the warring parties actually respect this new interim government?
Well, based on historical precedent, no, of course. I mean, Jum'ah's explanation of the Khairat process, I mean, that was the design of a government of national accord. It was formerly called the unity government, but they couldn't necessarily use that term at the time. And essentially, that was an interim government. It was supposed to stay for anywhere between 12 and 18 months. But it dragged on for 5 years because it was refused and rejected by Aguila Saleh, the chief of the parliament in the east, and his ally, the Khalifa Haftar, the commander of the Libyan National Army. So I think based on precedent, it's going to be very difficult to assume how we go forward, because in no uncertain terms, this deal is a loss for Haftar. And it's a loss because he has a very specific goal and a very specific structure in mind as to how this process should have ended. And it does relate to the last 4 or 5 years of diplomacy between the LNA and between the GNA and Tripoli. And that was specifically to merge the GNA and the LNA at the military level and have Khalifa Haftar at the helm of the LNA. But in order to preserve that structure, it was a reconfiguration of the Presidential Council. The president's role, it is also the supreme commander of the armed forces, and it can tamper, change, and alter its structures. And it can also reappoint its head, Khalifa Haftar. So their main candidate was Aguila Saleh, who had appointed Khalifa Haftar in 2015, March 2015, and had also structured its tribal glue that holds it together. Now the unknown, they may have to go to a plan, because Mohammed al-Manafi, whilst he is a member of the East, he's from Cyrenaica, the eastern part of Libya, he is not their first candidate. And I think because of the earliness of this, we're still in the unknown. But that might be a problem for them. And I suspect, given the last 5 years of their rejection of the last presidential council, unless they have it in a configuration that suits them, we could be back at square one. It could be a very long 12 months.
Wolfgang, what are the biggest and most immediate challenges that this new interim government is going to face?
Well, I would say at first, the new presidential council and the government of national unity could be a very positive step if the House of Representatives and the High Council of State confirm it. The non-elected Sarraj government was definitely in a dead-end road. But as you indicated, there is a myriad of problems which remains, just a few of them. For the time being, legitimacy comes from the non-elected Libya Political Dialogue Forum. This could change within a couple of weeks. The past of Ali Dbeiba is under debate. You know, he was the head of the Libyan Investment and Development Holding Company under Gaddafi, and he is or was allegedly involved in corruption, money laundering, financing of the Muslim Brotherhood, vote buying, and so on and so on. Regardless if this is true or not, it's all about perception. Another important one is Tripoli is not represented in the Presidential Council. We'll see what will happen with the government. The East does not really feel represented. Who is in the future the political representation of the East? Certainly not Aguila Saleh. And apart from the Tuareg, the South also doesn't really feel represented. We have now 5 bodies with unclear competencies: the LPDF, the Presidential Council, the government, the HR, and the High Council of State. The legal framework for the elections is unclear. Who needs to agree on it? So much will depend on how Dbeiba approaches the problem, and probably most important, how he will try to win the trust of the others. This could go through the composition of the government and the top public positions. He will, I would say, probably reach out to the governorates and the municipalities to achieve this. We'll see in the next few weeks.
Juma, let me ask you, how likely is it that elections will actually happen as they're supposed to in December? And also, is it likely that we'll see a constitutional referendum before then?
Well, I think the constitutional referendum is a little bit problematic because simply the draft, which was hammered out in 2017 by an elected body of 60, there are certain groups in Libya, I think very important groups, ethnic minorities like the Amazigh, the Tuareg, the Tabu, and some federalists in the East have serious concerns about this draft, and they have been demanding that this draft should be reopened and address their concerns so that there is a much wider consensus among the Libyan society to go forward with draft constitution. So maybe the wise step is to actually leave the draft constitution on the side and go ahead and elect a new parliament, maybe for 4 years, and allow that parliament to revisit the constitutional draft and see if they can work out an understanding with these important groups which have a concern about the constitution. As far as the elections are concerned, if there is an international will and an international pressure for elections to take place, it is possible for them to take place, especially in the west of Libya, where almost 70% of the population are residing, and those 70% of the population are totally out of the control of Haftar and his militias and his forces. So, and we have seen in the last 6 months municipal elections that were carried out in Misrata and Zlitan, in Tripoli, in other areas, which went relatively smooth and transparent, and even those who doubted the results, they went to the court and they got the right decision to recount or to carry out these elections again. So there is a transparency, there is a culture that's taking place in Libya to actually go about doing elections and try to ensure that they are fair and transparent. So if it's done at the local level, it can be done at the parliamentarian level as well. Of course, security is important. Supporting the election commission, which is a sovereign commission in Libya, and I think recently Sarraj confirmed that he's given them all the budget they needed, 50 million Libyan dinar, and all the support they needed. Supporting that commission is important because it is the commission that needs to oversee these elections and carry them out. Now, big question is, can we carry out parliamentarian elections in the east and the south, where 30% of the Libyan population are residing? Will Haftar and his militias allow parliamentarian elections to take place? Does he really believe in elections and in democracy? Well, we know he doesn't believe in elections and democracy. We know his discourse is all about military rule and one-man rule. But can be enough regional and international pressure on Haftar to actually not to interfere and to allow these elections to take place, and possibly encourage some of his loyalists and supporters to take place and to take part in those elections as well, especially in areas under his control in the east and in the south. But another very important factor is that the Libyan electorate in general, the Libyan society, they want to see genuine improvement in socioeconomic conditions, in security, and they want to see a light at the end of the tunnel before they can enthusiastically take part in any further elections, because the uptake in 2014 was very low compared to 2012. So we need to make it worthwhile for the Libyan citizen, the average Libyan citizen, to say, yes, elections are important, it's worth taking part because they are going to frame our future and give us hope for everybody. So a combination of indigenous factors that have to be right and international pressure to ensure that these elections take place. But we definitely need fresh elections. We need a new parliament to do away with this dichotomy we had for the last 6 years, with a dichotomy of two parliaments, two governments, and so on.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I actually want to ask Anas to expand on a point that you were making. Anas, let me ask you from your perspective, would warlord Khalifa Haftar allow elections to take place in the parts of the country that he's in control of?
In the east of the country, Khalifa's forces kidnapped a female parliamentarian, Ms. Siham Sorgawa, in July 2019. So she went out publicly against Khalifa Haftar's war on Tripoli. And I certainly think it comes to the deeper question. And the deeper question here is that over the past decade, since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, there are essentially these two irreconcilable visions of the state. That's why we have these parallel administrations. That's why we have two administrations, two governments, two very different military structures in the east and the west of the country. And essentially, these structures are at their essence about how the state should be shaped. And I think in that respect, democracy at the ballot level is a real problem for Khalifa Haftar when it means having a genuine choice about the shape of the state and the structures of the state. And I think that's why the next 12 months are important, because essentially there is one track that we're forgetting from this conversation, the military track, the unification of the rival militaries on the ground under the GNA and under the LNA. And if the structures that Khalifa Haftar seeks to embed, and his backers that have essentially helped him over the last several years in the UAE and in France and in Russia, if they seek to really stick their feet in over the next 8 months, it wouldn't really matter whether or not it's just about elections. The second factor would be, how do we have an army that is essentially under the control of a civilian presidency? How do we make sure that it's responsive, that it's neutral, that it respects and is subservient to that next elected ruler? And I think there's a very, very dangerous part of this ongoing state building project that we're forgetting, because that's what's going to define the political character of the state. And I think Khalifa Haftar is really the acid test. This next interim government has a real test in how it engages with the Libyan National Army. It has a real test in character of how it engages with the parliament that is under control of the Libyan National Army's ally, Agila Saleh. And it also has this major problem, this dilemma, under the bed here that we're not talking about, which is that there are 20,000 foreign mercenaries on Libya's ground, many of them who have just missed a deadline that passed in mid-January to remove their foreign forces and withdraw, as a result of the permanent ceasefire agreement that was signed in Geneva on the 20th or 23rd of October 2020. So there are so many little issues here that are niggling. And I think that they give you a glimmer and a sense of how difficult it's going to be to push.
Wolfgang, I saw you nodding, so I wanted to see if you wanted to jump in and add to what Anas was saying. But I also want to ask you about a point that he was making, which is what is going to happen when it comes to these foreign fighters that are in Libya? And what about the international players who are involved backing one side or the other in the Libyan conflict? Now that this interim government is going to be in place, what's going to happen with them?
Well, it's all about interests. As long as the international major powers involved in Libya, like Turkey, like Egypt, like Russia, see their interest, their strategic interest ensured and guaranteed, they could be willing to withdraw. A major issue about an eventual withdrawal would be something like confidence building. And for this confidence building, it is important that the ceasefire, that the current ceasefire gets ensured. This means that the UN plan, deploying an international civilian monitoring force, really comes to the ground. And for such an international monitoring force, it would be important that they are properly staffed and equipped to provide a realistic and a real picture of what's going on the ground. In other words, if such an international monitoring mission consists just of 30 or 50 monitors who are accompanying patrols of the east or of the west along the ceasefire line, we can forget about it. if this international monitoring force receives support by, let's say, European Union Operation Irini with technical equipment, with satellites, with reconnaissance aircraft flying outside of the Libyan airspace, with electronic intelligence and so on, they would be able to provide a realistic picture of what's going on the ground. This would help for confidence building. This would make it more unlikely that major hostilities break out again. And if this is unlikely, I would say the need to keep Turkish troops and Russians and others in Libya would be not that urgent.
Jum'a, let me ask you, the UN Secretary General has called on all Libyan and international parties to respect the interim agreement. I want to also ask you about the international parties involved in Libya right now. Do you expect that these actors are going to actually respect the interim agreement?
Well, in 2015, when we had Skhirat agreement and we signed it, all the ambassadors and some of the foreign ministers of all the actors in Libya were there present, and they gave their support, lip service. Yes, we support this agreement, we support the new government, and they kept doing that over the table. France, Egypt, the Emiratis, the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the British, the Italians, everybody was there, and they all gave support. But we know that some key players over the last 5 years under the table were actually undermining the Skhirat agreement, and they did exactly the opposite. Then they were fueling the war, giving Haftar all what he needed to spoil everything. And in 2019, again, we were going to a Gdamis meeting, which organized by the UN, which was supposed to reach a final political agreement as well. And 10 days earlier, Haftar spoiled that. So the question is, what are they going to do now? We've already heard statements yesterday and this morning, paying lip service, saying yes, they support the new body, the new executive power in Libya. But under the table, are they going to carry on what they have been doing the last few years and keep undermining it for their own narrow interest and agenda? That is the key question. However, the dynamics have changed a lot in Libya. The international players in Libya and their influence has changed. I think now, over the last 2 years, it is Russia and Turkey who have become the key players at the expense possibly of France and Italy and so on. Also, the new American administration could make a difference. Now, if we have an alignment between the key players, let's say between the United States, Turkey, Russia, and Egypt, a real alignment about supporting this new government, about supporting the peaceful track by saying that we should not allow Libyans to go back to war. And by the way, I don't believe Haftar has the decision today to restart the war. I think that's out of his hand. Haftar cannot restart the war unless the Russians agree to it and the Egyptians agree to it. And I don't think they will. They see their interests now more served in the political track rather than the military track. So if we have these alignments between these major players in Libya, then yes, I think international will and international support for this new executive body, which is supposed to be there only for a year or possibly a year and a half, can make a difference, can achieve at least some of the objectives that have been set out for it. And but if the international community carry on their divisions and carry on the hypocrisy and the dual strategy of supporting over the table and undermining under the table, then I'm afraid it's going to be more of the same in Libya, more division and more conflict and just deepening of the and prolonging the suffering of the Libyan population. So in a sense, it's unfortunate that we say this.
Jum'a, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just that we've only got about a minute left, so I just want to ask one more question to Anas real quick. Anas, how are the Libyan people perceiving all of this? Are they hopeful right now?
I think it's very difficult to tell. I won't profess to be a representative of the Libyan people themselves, but I assume and hope, based on the things that we've seen over the last several days, that they're holding their breath. And I imagine that it's cautious optimism at best. But there's still a lot left in this. We shouldn't call it too early. I think the major actors here have acted, in bad faith over the last several years. The last time we were at a negotiation table in Berlin in January 2020, the very same actors that, as Jum'a has mentioned, paid lip service to respecting the arms embargo, violated it during the meeting in the east of Libya, specifically the UAE and others like Russia and Egypt. But also Turkey then also assumed that this was their moment then to then pass legislation and deliver their own troops. There is a precedent for this. We shouldn't call it too early, but cautious optimism at best.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Jum'a Al-Khumati, Anas Al-Gumati, and Wolfgang Pustai. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.